next speaker is Steve Hatfield Dodds. Steve is a visiting scientist working on climate change and sustainability at CSIRO and an adjunct professor at the Crawford School of Economics and Public Policy at the ANU. From 2008 to 2010, Steve led the Strategy, Projections and Analysis branch in the Australian Government Department of Climate Change and Energy Efficiency. In his previous career, he's been with CSIRO, the Allen Consulting Group, the Commonwealth Treasury and the Department of Environment and Heritage and the ANU. Steve.
Thanks very much, John. So, Frank, who comes after me, is quite concerned because he knows how many slides I've got. So I'm going to apologise in advance that some bits Louise has covered better than I could, so I'm just going to jump over them. But the storyline for my talks is essentially the international negotiations are going very well, mostly due to Louise, but they're not quite there yet. Okay, there's a tension in the negotiations text that they commit to 2 degrees, or they set a goal of 2 degrees, and then they have a set of pledges and rules that in aggregate don't deliver on that. And so there's a gap in the negotiations. And of course, as curious, mostly economists, we wonder, why is this? Previous discussion in economics has essentially assumed rational actors. It says, if countries aren't participating, it's probably because it's not in their interest to participate, or that it would be in their interest, but they can't come up with a set of arrangements that binds free riders, distributes the gains from the agreement in relevant ways, and thus is attractive. So actually, most of my talk is going to be about that issue of material interest in the economic analysis. But really, what I discover from that review of the literature is it's clearly, it's unambiguously, overwhelmingly in the interests of both the global community and all the major emitters to do something. So what's stopping them? And I offer 2 potential issues: geopolitics, which is really the effect of non-climate interests and factors on the climate negotiations, and then narrative, both of which Louise has touched on. And at the end, I'll skip through quickly, the so what would we do, differently. So, world is on track to at least 4 degrees. Louise already covered that. If you go back and look at, historic projections and then compare them to actual behaviour, that's the slide on whatever it is, you're right. We're tracking at the top of that curve. So this slide here from the assessment, the 4th IPCC assessment report, doesn't even graph the worst scenario, which is the high economic growth fossil fuel intensive scenario. So it's above the red line there, and we're tracking slightly above that one, which isn't on the graph. So we're going for at least 4 degrees at the moment. And the science is telling us not only that that's bad, but as they get better information over time, it looks worse. And so this is 2 versions of the burning ember diagram, which goes through different areas. The first one is from the 3rd assessment report in 2001. And I want to draw your attention to the 5th of those columns, which is what they call large-scale discontinuities. This is things like the thermohaline conveyor shutting down, or ice caps melting rapidly, those sorts of things which are hard to manage and difficult to insure for. Those ones in particular, the science is now much more pessimistic, that predictions of impact are more severe and occur at lower temperature ranges. And so the science climate essentially comes down to, what's your tolerance for risk, with a little bit of ethics thrown in there, because it's risk that isn't largely borne by us as emitters. And this is the case for 450. 450 is like putting 3 bullets in your 6-shooter and pointing at your kneecap and pulling the trigger, and 550 is like putting 5 bullets in the 6-shooter and giving it a spin. So 450 sounds pretty good. As Louise said, I was involved in climate policy when we were working out the national interest statement. I think the national interest statement for Australia, this is a personal comment, which should not be attributed to CSIRO, makes very good sense. And so where does the economics go from this? Well, the first point to make is that the, quote, economics, unquote, of climate science is firmly multidisciplinary. Okay, so this is economics and economists assembling components from other disciplines, from the science. And so they build integrated assessment models, which are sort of growth models, that have an emissions trajectory implied. They take that emissions trajectory and they feed it into a climate damage function over time, and then they sort of discount back the costs and benefits of alternative trajectories. Trajectories both have a stabilisation component, and for any given trajectory, because stabilisation is a stock of emissions in the atmosphere, for any given stabilisation level, there's a bunch of different trajectories you can get there. And so the traditional focus of the models is a constrained optimisation problem. You know, you want to work out where it's best to go, given a set of abatement costs, a climate sensitivity, which is the response function of the climate to emissions, a damage function, which is the response, the impact on the economy of a given climate outcome, economic trends, business as usual growth, discount rates, and so forth. And so all the major studies find that significant global action is worthwhile. Okay? They find that once you've decided that, going there in a sensible way is lower cost than sort of ignoring it for a while and then rushing at the end. And most of the studies support stabilisation at 550 or below. And I'll go into that in a bit more depth. So this is the peaking issue. This is very familiar to anybody watching the Australian discussion. Once you've decided to move, start now. But this is the more interesting thing, the discussion about stabilisation levels. So Stern came out in 2006, the book was published in 2007. He recommended stabilisation between 450 and 550, but focused, especially in the media, on 550 and commented that 450 might, just be too difficult pragmatically. He has shifted in his interpretation and communication of his analysis, and now says that 550 is the upper limit you should consider, and that 500 parts per million or lower would be better. It still puts you on track for warming of 2.5 degrees or more. Garneau came out, he only analysed 550 and 450, but the logic of his case is essentially, he's explicitly you should do 450, and the logic of his case is that you should do 450 or lower if you can get away with it. Marty Weitzman doesn't really buy into stabilisation trajectories as such in his thing, but he says we should go as fast as possible and we should be seriously exploring geoengineering as a sort of safety net for humanity, because we might regret it otherwise. And so Nordhaus is the outlier. Okay? Nordhaus does all this analysis and comes to a conclusion that the optimal temperature increase for the world is around 5 degrees. And anybody else who's at all familiar with climate science just looks blank. How can you do that? So that was his 2008 model. And I'll come back to the reasons in a sec, but it's worth knowing that in June last year, Nordhaus put out a new article in one of the best journals, arguing that we should peak fairly high, but we should return to 500 parts per million. So he's now arguing that 3 degrees would be optimal. That's quite a shift. Fortunately for anybody interested in this topic, he doesn't explain that shift at all. And even more importantly, in his 2008 work, he explicitly examines the case where you limit global warming to 2 degrees or more, and he concludes it has net costs. Okay, so the strict reading of the 2008 work is it's better to do absolutely nothing about global warming and bear all those costs in the future than to try and limit to 2 degrees. And now he finds in his latest model run that it is beneficial. The benefits are about half the net benefits of his preferred trajectory. But in terms of overlapping consensus, that's a very important shift in the economics, and I think suggests a weak emerging consensus. So what drives this sort of stylised debate between Nordhaus and Stern was Weitzman looking on and Garneau, of course, being part of the discussion as well. But the original response to the Stern report essentially said this is all about discount rates. That Stern uses a low discount rate that he would, many people would argue, not consistent with observed returns on capital and so forth. And that was certainly Nordhaus's explanation of why the prescription is different. Other people gave much more explicit attention to risk and uncertainty. The graphs you've seen so far of temperature outcomes all have bands because the climate science is uncertain in the response of the sensitivity of the climate. And so there are low probability catastrophic events. And in the full paper, if you can get around to downloading it afterwards, I quote the US security think tank, where their 4 degrees scenario makes you feel like packing up and moving to another planet, even before you get to this sort of 6-degree catastrophic impacts scenario. So those low probability events, which are probably more likely than your house burning down, have really significant impacts for the calculus. There are other issues. There's methods, particularly whether you just trust one integrated assessment model, whether you think the sort of Clint Eastwood photo about the gun makes a difference if they're shooting you a child rather than you, sort of your ethical stance on that. And some more technical issues in the climate damage function, how that interacts with how you treat risk or probability distributions, and some interesting work on relative prices, which connects to Alan Randall's talk yesterday about sort of critical capital and weak and strong sustainability. But essentially, 2 things come out of the literature over the last few years, 2008 through to today. The first is to get a Nordhaus result, as we'll call it, you need a combination of factors. It's not just discount rates. And playing with some of these other things, quite defensible, conservative variations on his parameters, will give you Stern-like results, even with Nordhaus-like discount rates and time preference. So, I think the more fundamental thing that comes out is care of a brilliant article by Hoffman, Dennels and so forth from 2008, which basically they use a different model and they run through a huge number of stabilisation levels. And what they find is that the Stern sort of optimality prescription is like a marble on a flat table. Right? It's essentially arbitrary. That there's almost no difference in the optimality calculation between a stabilisation of 600 up to 850, and you're only talking 1/3 of 1% difference in the net present value of consumption to go right back to 550. And so that result, I think, underpins the intuition of why Nordhaus between 2008 and 2010 can make some apparently very small changes in his model, which he doesn't explain very much, and he gets this huge shift in what he prescribes as optimal. That graph makes me very cautious about relying on any sort of optimality prescription rather than sort of an overlapping consensus approach. So the summary of the economics is that all the studies support significant global action. Most are below, support stabilisation of 550 or below, with a fair bit of precaution in them, and you've now got this new emerging consensus that the economics essentially is now in line with the scientific community at supporting 2 degrees or lower. In the paper I go into a fairly elaborate assessment of country-level impacts, because you'd expect country participation in a global agreement to reflect their view of impacts on them rather than the global one. The data is not nearly as rich for making that assessment, but essentially all the major countries, it's pretty clear that the policy community now believes it's in their interest. It's not clear that every politician is engaged and has come to that view. But one of the key things, people who've been following this for a while will be aware that Canada and Russia and so forth used to say 2 degrees, bring it on, that's fabulous. There's now a growing awareness that 2 degrees average means more than 4 or 5 degrees towards the pole. 4 degrees means 7 to 15 degrees towards the pole. If you want to do anything like drive on the road or have buildings that stand up, you just can't get away with those sorts of temperatures that close to the pole.